The impudence, the audacity, the unmitigated gall of those knuckleheads of liberty podcasters, daring to voice opinions outside the mainstream of accepted thought. Listen if you dare. It's angry, it's funny, it's even sometimes sad, but it's always based on freedom and justice, as you will see. Here's our host, Jason McPhee.
Welcome to the Knuckleheads of Liberty. We are coming at you on May 25th, 2022, somehow just staggering our way through this horrifying experience of being of authoritarian rule from Biden, but somehow we're still on our feet. But today we have a little bit of an escape for you. We are going to be interviewing a special guest, Richard Fields. He has been the press secretary for the National Libertarian Party, and he's also had a lot of experience too with our Libertarian Counterpoint show as well. So before we get into that, though, let me introduce you to our panel. In our upper right-hand corner, we have our screaming eagle of freedom, Tim Everett. He is a pilot in the state of California. My name is Jason McPhee, and I'll be your host today. And we are without Leon this week, so we'll hope to get him back next week. And our guest, again, is on our upper left-hand corner, and that's Richard Fields. So, Richard, you've been you've had, I guess, an interesting hand in fighting for liberty over a long period of time. I guess 30 years with Libertarian Counterpoint and a couple of years doing the press secretary role for the National Libertarian Party. So I guess tell us a little bit about this journey that you've had in liberty, and maybe we could talk a little bit about some of these things you've been doing.
Well, actually, it goes back even further than that. It goes back to 1972, which is 50 years, something like that. In 1972, I was a young guy hosting a radio talk show in Racine, Wisconsin. And it was actually 1971. And somebody, a lady by the name of Helen Slavens, called me up out of the blue and said, I'm a member of a new political party. It's the Libertarian Party, and we have a candidate for president running this year. His name is John Hospers. I'd like to come on your talk show and tell people about John Hospers. And since I'm, working at a radio station in a very small market, Racine, Wisconsin, always on the lookout for interesting guests, I thought, well, what the heck, I'll put the lady on. So she and her husband came on the show, and I asked them the questions that I asked all of the politicians that I had on the show. Now, the politicians at that time just making a difference. Doug LaFollette, who was a distant relation of the Fighting LaFollette clan, the progressives in Wisconsin. I had Les Aspin, who was a congressman from that district at the time. Later on, became the Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration. So, interesting guests. But I would ask, a series of questions of all of the folks that came on the show, all of the politicians, and I asked those same questions. And lo and behold, Jim and Helen answered the questions correctly. First time that had ever happened, they gave the libertarian answer. And I, at the time, figured out, well, if they're answering questions in the way that I would answer those questions, I must be one. And so at that point, on the show, I think, I decided to join the Libertarian Party and support John Hospers for President of the United States. And he went on to win one electoral vote because Roger McBride was a renegade elector from the state of one of the Carolinas. And
well, Richard, can I stop you right there, because that's pretty extraordinary in and of itself. I mean, in this day and age where we have so many discussions with people, and the idea that we talk to people about these ideas of liberty, and it's so hard to get anybody to change, and you just heard these ideas on air and you just changed. That's amazing.
Well, let me go back a few more years beyond that. I mean, I grew up in a pretty much a traditional Republican household, so the traditional Republican values. And by traditional, I mean traditional back in the 50s, which was essentially Taft Republicanism, not the Nixon variety, which totally corrupted the brand. So I had a pretty good grounding in property rights, in free markets, and that sort of thing. My traditional upbringing was not so good on civil liberties. I kind of came across that on my own. I was the guy that always asked my mother why, drove her nuts by asking her why as a kid. And I pretty much come to the conclusion that, the drug laws were stupid and the sex laws, all the vice laws were stupid. But I didn't really.
Well, Richard, you may have discovered the secret. I think maybe the problem is Republicans and Democrats just never ask why. They just just continue to go along with whatever the script is.
Well, there's a lot of that. There's certainly a lot of, my tribe says this. In order to stay in the tribe, I have to agree with everything they say. Therefore, I will squelch any questions I have about things that don't make any sense on both Democrat and Republican side. Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. But anyway, so I had a little bit of, libertarian leanings. Read Ayn Rand when I was in college, so that helped a little bit. Didn't take me the whole way. She was not a libertarian. She was somewhat in that direction. Anyway, moved me in the right direction. So by the time these people came on my talk show, I said, yeah, I'll be a part of that. And so I did. And from there, I later on moved to Madison, Wisconsin, and worked in radio there. And the chairman of the local Libertarian Party, the statewide Libertarian Party, called me up out of the blue and said, hey, how would you like to run for Congress against Bob Kastenmeier? And I said, let me think about it for a day. I thought about it for a day, and I said, sure, I'll run for Congress as a Libertarian against Bob Kastenmeier, who at the time was a long-term incumbent in a highly Democratic, totally safe Democratic district. There was a token Republican in the district, and it was interesting the way the vote finally came out. I got about 3-4% of the vote, and the Republican won all of the counties except Dane County. All of the counties other than Dane County were rural. Dane County was urban, home of the University of Wisconsin, and very liberal. And that was, of course, the home base for Kastenmeier and why he always got reelected. But what was interesting back then, the local media, and I'm talking about the Wisconsin State Journal and the Wisconsin Capital Times. One was a Republican newspaper, the other was a Democratic newspaper, a morning and an afternoon, and as well as the campus, the equivalent to the News and Review. There was a newspaper like that. Those were all pretty much willing to give me full coverage. Now, granted, I was an exceptionally verbose and candidate that was able to express my views and not make a fool of myself for the most part. But I got full coverage. I got just as much ink, just as much TV time. I was invited to the one debate that took place. Nevertheless, I still only got about 3-4% of the vote. Later on, a couple of years later, I ran for state assembly, pretty much the same story in Wisconsin. And at that point, I went into the radio station ownership business, moved to Texas. And other than doing an editorial on my radio station every day, pretty much got out of active politics. I was in the media at that point. So I just did media stuff and pretty much did media stuff. Radio until I moved to California, did radio in California for a couple of years, moved to Kent, got on the sales side, did that up until 2006. So, a long time in print advertising. And while I was, when I moved to California, one of the first things I did as I looked up the Libertarian Party. At the time, there was no Libertarian Party to speak of in West Texas. Nobody, just didn't exist. But there was one in Sacramento, and Bob Gale, some of you may remember that name, was the ran Libertarian at the time. It was Libertarian Conspiracy, and so I gave him a call. I gave somebody a call. I forget who, and it's Gale. And I said, hey, I'm a Libertarian. I can probably talk about this sort of thing. And he said, well, your voice sounds okay. You seem to be, fairly articulate. Come on down. We'll put you on the show. So I went down to Access Sacramento, got on the show, and that was in 1990, I believe, and have been doing Libertarian Conspiracy, later changed its name to Libertarian Counterpoint, pretty much ever since. Most recently, more in the guest slot, since I'm not in Sacramento anymore.
Yeah. Well, I know you hosted a lot too, and in fact, I've been on the show a few times when you've been hosting. And how long have you been hosting the show? Has that been for a decade or so?
I'm
Or
not sure. I started hosting. That just sort of kind of came into place naturally. Um, the people who were hosting went away for whatever reason, and I just sort of naturally fell into that slot sometime in the mid '90s. I don't remember exactly when. It's when I started hosting, putting the topics together, making sure that there were guests for every show, and trying to get some interesting guests. And from time to time, we got a few interesting people.
Hmm. Okay.
You, of course, being high among them.
Well, it's funny, it just seems like this is such an interesting time. I guess maybe a lot of the times have been kind of interesting in the last 50 or so years, but it just seems like it's been pretty extraordinary these last 5 or 10 years with Trump and just sort of uh, the comfortableness that both the Democrats, more the Democrats now have with squelching free speech in the name of being concerned over certain words or other things like that, and just so it's really been one of those things where, at least for me, that's kind of brought my awakening. But it sounds like you had your awakening quite a long time ago on this stuff.
Yeah,
So
yeah. At the national level, the media has always been pretty much in thrall to whoever is controlling the government at the time. During the 40s, 50s, 60s, media was pretty much owned by Republicans, and Republicans, for the most part, controlled most of the major media outlets one way or another. That's gradually changed over time as the Republicans lost their majorities in Congress back in the 50s, and the Democrats took over and also took over in administrative at the presidential level. The media kind of followed along. In order to get access to the newsmakers, you kind of have to do and say and ask the right questions in order to get access to the newsmakers. And if you ask the wrong questions or uh, promulgate the wrong editorial beliefs, then you don't get the juicy interviews anymore. And so the media, knowing that they have to be able to cover the story, kind of plays along and gradually changes. So we've seen over my lifetime, I've seen a very gradual shift from a Republican inspired media to a Democratic media in terms of where most of the reporters and most of the ownership is coming from. It's been a gradual shift, but it's always been the case that whoever controls the government de facto controls what the media says. They don't do it through outright censorship, but they do it through limiting access to people that they don't think will give them the kind of coverage that they want to hear.
Hmm.
I mean, I noticed at first in the 1990s, the 90s during the Clinton era, it was kind of a transition period. We had the advent of the drugs report, the internet, the alternative media, which were not controlled by the government at the time. You had ABC, NBC, CBS that controlled pretty much everything that you heard on television. You had the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Associated Press that pretty much controlled anything that got any national coverage as far as print is concerned. And the radio stations were, for the most part, simply following whatever the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, said, or what AP said. They didn't do a whole lot of original reporting themselves. So, in effect, the government controlled, de facto controlled what the media said. And I heard Hillary Clinton complain about Drudge during the Monica Gate episodes. She complained that we don't have any intermediaries anymore. We don't have anybody that can essentially squelch what is going out over the internet. And that was a complaint of hers. We don't have the control over the media that we used to have. And she thought that was absolutely terrible. And that kind of opened up my eyes to what was going on as far as the government having de facto control of what the media says. It's not like TASS or Pravda in the Soviet Union, but it kind of it tends in that direction.
Well, perhaps that's who's pulling Biden's strings on this disinformation board right now, is to try
Well,
to
yeah,
get that
I mean,
mediary.
over the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, certainly since the Trump era, the media, the social media, which for the most part were pretty much, free for alls. Anybody could voice their opinion. Anybody could put whatever heterodox opinion out there that they wanted to on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, etc. Very, very, very clearly and kind of softly at first, but then very much obviously, government said, "Hey, you can't be saying all of these things. You can't be doing all of these things that we don't agree with." And the way they were able to make their influence felt was to call Zuckerberg into the congressional hearings, to call the heads of the other primary internet social media corporations, bringing them all in front of congressional hearings, giving them the third degree, and implicitly threatening regulation of the internet. And very effectively, they brought them into line. They said, the internet company said, we're going to have to censor ourselves, or we're going to be censored. And that's what you saw happen. And of course, with the removal of Trump from Twitter and the leftward tilt of the social media companies over the last 5-10 years, it's become more and more obvious that the conservative voices can't be heard except on non-mainstream media for sure, and internet more and more so. There are places like Parler and others that are fighting back. But the largest thing to remember is it's really not that much difference between what you're hearing when the Republicans were in control and when the Democrats are in control. You just hear a little bit of a different nuance. The main message is the same. Trust us, do as we say, don't rock the boat. We are in charge. We will do the right thing. Don't question us. That's what Republicans said back in the 50s and 60s, and that's what Democrats have been saying ever since, and they're both lying.
So where do you place your typical podcast? That would be media that you would access through Apple iTunes or Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts, or any of those other methods to organize your podcast, into a.
Well, podcasts are one area where anything goes still. The problem
Still.
is getting your podcast heard or watched. And for many years, Libertarian Counterpoint went on YouTube, and there was a Libertarian Counterpoint channel. And if you went to the search bar on YouTube and a Libertarian Counterpoint, and you'd be able to see every show that had ever been done, ranked by viewers, ranked by whatever. You could most recent posting and so forth. It was real easy to find Libertarian Counterpoint. In the last couple of years, I've noticed when I want to go look at the most recent show or whatever, I have to actually put Libertarian Counterpoints in quotes in order to get it to come up at all on YouTube. Otherwise, I get a bunch of garbage. So YouTube has changed their algorithms to make it more and more difficult for the uninformed audience to find us. And that's true with all kinds of podcasts. If your audience knows where to find you, it's still out there. But if your audience doesn't know where to find you, the internet giants are making it more and more difficult for anything other than mainstream kind of stuff. And by mainstream, I mean really kind of liberal slanted, left of center, if you want to call it that, mainstream. That's the only thing that's getting promoted at this point.
So it seems that as far as those podcasts go, it's more difficult now to find them if you don't really know where they are. You're not a subscriber, let's say. But what about for somebody that's a subscriber to a particular podcast? And let's pick Google as your example, since you used it before, about finding something you didn't really. Maybe you'd heard about it or something, you're just kind of searching for it, but you're not a subscriber. So let's let's say now you go one step further and you found this libertarian-based podcast and you subscribe to it. Wow, I really like this. I want to see this all the time. Is the algorithms at Google even hiding those from people that are subscribers today? Would you say?
And I'm not an internet guru enough to answer that question.
Okay. Okay.
Well, hey, Richard, there's something I kind of wanted to shift into talking about your experience at the as the press secretary role in the for the Libertarian Party. And James, maybe we could get that image up on the screen too, just to so we know it's all for real. So, anyways, yeah, this is a press release that they made when they had picked Richard to fill this role. But anyways, as we've been talking about the challenge of getting the message out, I guess your role in that was to was it to put out the positions of the Libertarian Party on different items that were in the news, or was it about working with the candidates to put out messaging? Could you describe a little bit about what your job was there?
Yeah, it was all of that and more. I was, as it turned out, I essentially became the voice of the executive director, Wes Benedict, at the time, and the chairman, Nick Sarwark, at the time. So whenever you saw a quote put out in a press release for either of those guys, I probably wrote that quote. Everything went out under their approval. I didn't put anything out that they hadn't read first, but I would, something would come up in the news, some ridiculous thing that Trump did, or some ridiculous thing that happened in terms of the Obama administration and healthcare. I'm trying to remember the years involved. But whenever something particularly horrendous or newsworthy in current events happened, I would write the Libertarian Counterpoint, the Libertarian Party position on that particular issue in the voice of one of the either Nick or Wes, or in the case of campaigns, one of the candidates who was running for Senate or a local issue or a local race somewhere or another. So I kind of wrote things. I was more or less a ghostwriter in the form of press releases.
Well, as you were doing that role, because we were just talking about the outreach and the possibility of these social media giants throttling, were you experiencing anything like that while you were press secretary? Did you feel like you would put these things out, and were they getting a fair shake? Or just curious what your experience was with that.
Well, it was interesting. The way I got the job, I interviewed with Wes, I interviewed with Nick, interviewed with both of them together, and they gave me an assignment. They said to write a news release on something to do with healthcare. I don't remember exactly what the subject was, but something to do with Obamacare, if I remember right. And so I wrote a press release on it, and it got picked up by the Washington Times. That's the number 2 newspaper in Washington, D.C., the conservative one, which is kind of there because they have to have a conservative voice. It doesn't have very much circulation compared to the Washington Post, but it does exist, and it's a real mainstream newspaper. They picked it up, so they figured, we've got somebody that can get a mainstream news results, and they hired me. That was the last thing the mainstream newspaper at the national level published that I wrote. It was pretty sad, pretty disheartening. But where we did have success was at the local and regional level. Newspapers at the local level, radio stations at the local and regional level, and even TV stations at the local and regional level were not quite as, did not feel as compelled as the national media do to follow the party line, whether it's Democrat, Republican, or whatever. So we had the results at the local and regional level, and quite a bit there. As far as social media is concerned, that was when social media was just beginning to start to tighten up. So we still had some pretty good results in terms of my stories getting a lot of coverage, being retweeted and posted on Facebook and so forth.
Well, I guess, since you've had such varied experience, I guess, and we're getting closer to the end of the show here. So I'm wondering, what are some of the lessons you'd like to share with your struggle for liberty over your lifetime? Because, I mean, like you said, you've been working at this for decades. And, I'm sure that there's some, if you had, just a message you wanted to get out there for people, as far as some hard lesson learned in this fight for liberty, what would that be?
It would be to pay very close attention to what Ron Paul was able to do. And by that I mean Ron Paul was the only libertarian. He was actually a libertarian candidate for president on the libertarian ticket back in 1988. He eventually got elected to Congress many times as a Republican, but he was at heart a libertarian. And what he was able to do better than anybody else I've ever seen was explain how central bank policy, the Federal Reserve, is used as an instrument of government to rob the citizenry blind. And people on the left know something is wrong. They know that their raises are not going up as fast as inflation. They know that the top 2% or 1% or whatever you want to call it has gotten an increasingly larger slice of the economic pie. And they know they consider that to be unjust. And they are correct. It is unjust. What they don't understand is the modus operandi of the top 2% or 1%. They don't know how they do it. And the way they do it is they are able to, when the Federal Reserve, the central bank in the United States, and this is true worldwide, whether it's the Central Bank of Europe or the Central Bank of China or the Central Bank of wherever, central banks create money. They use that newly created money initially to buy assets in the form of bailing out banks that have extended loans to recklessly, corporations that have bounced up their balance sheet, borrowed too extensively, and so forth. So what they're doing is they're putting money into the asset markets. By asset markets, we're talking stocks and bonds. Stocks and bonds are owned by the top 10%. The vast majority of stocks and bonds are owned by those who are already very wealthy. They get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier as the Fed increases the money supply. The guy down at the bottom end, the bricklayer, the mason, the carpenter, the truck driver, they might see a pittance of a raise, probably not as great as inflation. So they're pissed off, and they should be pissed off. They don't understand why it's happening. And Ron Paul was able to explain that in such a way and so effectively that he was able to get a huge following on liberal college campuses. He was able to get the left to understand what was going on, how they were getting bamboozled. And of course, the right understood that all along, or at least the economically savvy people on the right. They've always understood it's a problem. But getting the people on the left to understand it was very difficult. Ron Paul was able to do that. So I think any effort by libertarians to move beyond the third-party status that we're in right now has to be extremely good and articulate about explaining how the economy is, how the elite or the deep state or whatever you want to call it, the top 2%, whatever you want to call it, the people who have, how they continue to have and have more. They have to be able to explain the mechanics of how that's happening and what can be done to stop it. That's number one.
Yeah, no,
number two, very briefly, is libertarians have to sit together and stop the internal bickering and fighting.
Well, and unfortunately, we are right at the end of our show. So, but we thank you so much for joining us today and for all the insights you've given us into your career fighting for liberty. And for our guests, until the next one, stay free.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, always and forever.
Thank you for listening to the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast. Find us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, your favorite podcast network, and at knuckleheadsofliberty.com.